Sarah Martinez had saved for 3 years to make this trip to London happen. At 28, she worked double shifts at a diner in Phoenix, Arizona, putting away every spare dollar she could find. Her dream was simple but powerful. She wanted to see the world beyond her small hometown, starting with the iconic sights of England. The summer of 2019 finally brought her moment. With her worn backpack and a camera that belonged to her grandfather, Sarah stepped off the plane at Heathrow Airport. Her heart raced with excitement as she took her first breath of London air. Everything felt different here. The accents, the architecture, even the way people walked seemed more purposeful. Her first stop was obviously Buckingham Palace. Sarah had seen it in countless movies and photographs, but nothing prepared her for the real thing. The golden gates gleamed in the afternoon sun, and tourists from every corner of the world pressed against the barriers, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty. But Sarah's attention was drawn to something else entirely: the royal guards standing perfectly still at their posts. These weren't just any soldiers. They were part of Britain's most elite regiments, trained to protect the royal family with their lives. Their red tunics were immaculate, their black bearskin hats towered above the crowd, and their faces remained completely expressionless, despite hundreds of people trying to make them smile, laugh, or even blink. One guard in particular caught Sarah's eye. He stood about 6 feet tall, probably in his early 20s, with the kind of rigid posture that comes from years of military training. His name tag read Guardsman Thompson, though tourists weren't supposed to get close enough to read such details. What struck Sarah most wasn't his uniform or his stillness. It was something in his eyes that seemed distant, almost sad. The crowd around the guards was typical of any major tourist attraction. People snapped selfies, made jokes, and tried various tactics to get reactions. Some tourists made funny faces, others told jokes loudly, and a few even attempted to touch the guards' uniforms before being quickly stopped by police officers patrolling the area. Sarah watched this circus for nearly an hour, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with how the guards were being treated. These were real people, not statues or entertainment. They had families, dreams, and feelings, yet they were expected to stand motionless while strangers treated them like objects. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah noticed something that made her heart sink. A small child had dropped his ice cream cone, and it splattered right near Guardsman Thompson's perfectly polished boots. The child began to cry, but his parents were too busy taking photos to notice. Other tourists stepped around the mess, some even laughing at the situation. But Sarah saw what others missed. For just a split second, Guardsman Thompson's eyes flickered down to the crying child. It was barely noticeable, but Sarah caught it, a tiny crack in his professional armor that revealed the human being underneath. That evening, back in her tiny hotel room, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. She researched the Royal Guards online, learning about their intense training, their dedication to duty, and the incredible discipline required for their job. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were active soldiers who had served in combat zones around the world. She read stories about guards fainting from heat exhaustion but not breaking position, about their rigorous selection process, and about the psychological challenges of remaining motionless for hours while crowds gathered around them. Some articles mentioned the mental health struggles that some guards faced, the isolation they felt, even while surrounded by hundreds of people, daily. The more Sarah learned, the more she felt a growing sense of empathy for these men and women. They sacrificed their comfort, their privacy, and sometimes their well-being to maintain a tradition that brought joy to millions of tourists each year. Yet most visitors saw them as nothing more than a photo opportunity. Sarah made a decision that night. She would return to Buckingham Palace the next day, but this time would be different. She wouldn't just be another tourist looking for the perfect Instagram shot. She had an idea that was both simple and potentially risky. She wanted to show one of these guards that someone saw them as a human being, not just a uniform. As she drifted off to sleep in her narrow hotel bed, Sarah had no idea that her small act of kindness would create a moment that would be remembered by thousands of people, shared across social media platforms, and spark conversations about humanity, duty, and the power of unexpected compassion. The next morning would change everything for both Sarah Martinez from Phoenix and Guardsman Thompson from Surrey. Neither of them knew it yet, but they were about to become part of a story that would touch hearts around the world and remind everyone watching that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact. The next morning brought heavy clouds and a steady drizzle that seemed to match London's reputation perfectly. Sarah woke up early, her mind still fixed on her plan from the night before. She dressed simply in jeans and a light sweater, nothing flashy that would draw attention to herself. Today wasn't about her, it was about showing kindness to someone who probably hadn't experienced much of it during his working hours. Meanwhile, across London in a small military barracks, 22-year-old James Thompson was preparing for another day of duty. He had been a Royal Guard for 18 months now, and the routine had become second nature. Polish boots until they gleamed, press uniform until every crease was razor sharp, check equipment, and mentally prepare for hours of absolute stillness, while tourists treated him like a living statue. James came from a working-class family in Surrey. His father was a plumber, his mother worked at a local school, and he had joined the army at 18 because he wanted to serve his country and see the world. The Royal Guards had seemed like an honor when he was selected, and in many ways it was, but the reality of the job was harder than he had expected. Standing motionless for hours while people laughed at him, tried to make him break character, and sometimes said cruel things they thought he couldn't hear was mentally exhausting. The physical demands were tough too, remaining perfectly still in heavy wool uniforms during summer heat waves, or staying rigid during winter storms when tourists stayed warm in nearby cafes. What bothered James most wasn't the discomfort, though. It was the way people looked through him rather than at him. To most tourists, he wasn't a person with thoughts, feelings, or a life outside his uniform. He was just part of the scenery, like the palace walls or the golden gates. Some days were harder than others. Yesterday had been particularly difficult. His girlfriend Emma had sent him a message that morning saying she needed to talk when he got home. Never a good sign in a relationship. His mind had wandered during his shift, wondering if the long hours and strict schedule of guard duty were putting too much strain on their relationship. Then there was the crying child with the dropped ice cream. James had wanted so badly to comfort the little boy, maybe even help clean up the mess, but his training and duty forbade any movement. These moments reminded him why the job could feel isolating, even while surrounded by hundreds of people. As James put on his bearskin hat that Tuesday morning, he tried to push away his personal worries and focus on the day ahead. He had no way of knowing that a young woman from Arizona was walking toward Buckingham Palace at that very moment, carrying with her a simple but powerful intention to brighten someone's day. Sarah arrived at the palace around 10 in the morning. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, giving everything a soft gray light that seemed perfect for what she had planned. She bought a cup of hot tea from a nearby vendor and found a spot where she could observe the guards without being in the way of other tourists. She watched as the guards took their positions for the day. There was Guardsman Thompson again, standing at the same post as yesterday. Sarah noticed how he settled into his stance, feet positioned precisely, shoulders back, eyes focused straight ahead. It looked effortless, but Sarah now understood the incredible discipline it required. The crowd began to gather as it did every day. Tour groups led by guides with colorful umbrellas, families with excited children, couples taking romantic photos, and solo travelers like herself all pressed forward for the best views. The familiar pattern began. Photos, jokes, attempts to get reactions from the guards. Sarah waited and watched. She wasn't in any hurry. Her plan required the right moment, when the crowd wasn't too thick and when she could approach without causing a major disturbance. She also wanted to make sure no police officers were looking directly her way, as she wasn't entirely sure how they would react to what she planned to do. As the morning progressed, Sarah noticed something that strengthened her resolve. A group of teenage boys had started making increasingly rude comments near Guardsman Thompson's position. They weren't being threatening, but their words were cruel and personal. They made jokes about his appearance, questioned his manhood for standing still, and laughed loudly at their own humor. Sarah could see the slightest tension around Thompson's eyes. He was hearing every word, absorbing every insult. But his training demanded he remain completely motionless and silent. The injustice of it made Sarah's chest tighten with anger and sympathy. The teenagers eventually moved on, but their behavior had been witnessed by several other tourists who seemed uncomfortable but did nothing to intervene. Sarah realized she wasn't the only person who felt bad about how the guards were sometimes treated, but most people simply didn't know how to respond or were too worried about breaking social conventions. Around noon, Sarah's moment finally came. The crowd had thinned slightly as some tour groups moved on to their next destinations. The rain began falling again, sending many tourists scurrying for cover under nearby trees and shop awnings. But Guardsman Thompson remained at his post, raindrops beating on his uniform and running down his face. Sarah approached slowly, her heart beating faster with each step. She had rehearsed what she wanted to do dozens of times in her mind, but now that the moment was here, she felt nervous. What if she got in trouble? What if she embarrassed him instead of helping? What if security officers tackled her before she could explain her intentions? But then she looked at his face again, stoic and professional on the surface. But she could sense the person underneath, someone who was probably missing his family, dealing with his own problems, and spending his days being treated as less than human by strangers who would never bother to learn his name. Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. She was going to show this young man that at least one person in the crowd saw him as a human being deserving of kindness and respect. She had no idea that her simple gesture would create a ripple effect that would spread far beyond the palace gates. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she stepped closer to Guardsman Thompson's position. The rain continued to fall steadily, creating small rivers that ran between the cobblestones and pooled around the palace grounds. Most tourists had found shelter, leaving only the most dedicated sightseers and photographers still braving the weather. She paused about 10 feet away from the guard, studying his face one more time. Raindrops clung to his eyelashes and rolled down his cheeks, but he remained perfectly still. Sarah could see the water soaking through his red tunic, and she wondered how cold he must be feeling. The temperature had dropped since morning, and she was shivering even in her warm sweater. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked directly up to Guardsman Thompson. She could feel a few remaining tourists watching her with curiosity, probably wondering what she was planning to do. A police officer about 30 yards away glanced in her direction but didn't seem alarmed. Not yet. When Sarah was just arm's length from the guard, she stopped and looked directly into his eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. She could see surprise flash briefly across his features before his training kicked back in, and his expression returned to its regulation blankness. "I see you," Sarah whispered, her voice so quiet that only he could hear. "I see that you're a real person, not just a uniform. I see that you're cold and wet and probably tired. I see that people haven't been very kind to you today." James heard every word clearly, though his face revealed nothing. Inside, he was stunned. In 18 months of guard duty, no tourist had ever spoken to him with such genuine warmth and recognition. Most people talked about him as if he weren't there, or made jokes at his expense. This young woman with the American accent was looking at him like she actually cared about his well-being. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small packet of tissues and a hand warmer, the kind used by hikers and outdoor workers. She had bought them that morning specifically for this moment. Without saying anything else, she gently tucked them into a small pocket on his uniform that was designed to hold ceremonial items. "For when your shift ends," she whispered. "You deserve to be warm and comfortable." But Sarah wasn't finished. In a gesture that surprised even herself, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Guardsman Thompson in a gentle, brief hug. It lasted only a few seconds, but in that moment, she tried to communicate everything she had observed and felt. That he mattered, that his service was appreciated, that someone had noticed his humanity. The reaction was immediate and unexpected. James felt something crack inside his chest. Not physically, but emotionally. This stranger's simple act of kindness hit him harder than any insult or joke ever had. For months he had felt invisible, reduced to nothing more than a tourist attraction. But this woman had seen him as a person worth caring about. Despite his rigorous training, despite years of military discipline, James felt his eyes begin to well up with tears. He blinked rapidly, trying to maintain his composure, but a single tear escaped and rolled down his cheek, mixing with the raindrops already there. The small crowd of tourists who had witnessed Sarah's gesture fell completely silent. They had been expecting the guard to remain motionless, to ignore her completely as guards always did. Instead, they were seeing something none of them had ever witnessed before. A royal guard showing genuine human emotion while on duty. Someone in the crowd gasped softly. A few people reached for their phones, but something about the moment felt too sacred to interrupt with photography. An elderly British couple who had been visiting the palace for their anniversary looked at each other with tears in their own eyes. Sarah stepped back, looking up at James with a gentle smile. She could see that her gesture had affected him deeply, and she felt a mixture of joy and concern. She hadn't meant to put him in a difficult position or get him in trouble with his superiors. "Thank you for your service," she said softly, just loud enough for him to hear. "Take care of yourself." She turned to walk away, but something extraordinary happened. In a moment that would be talked about for years to come, James broke protocol in the smallest but most meaningful way possible. He whispered back, his voice barely audible but clear enough for Sarah to hear. "Thank you," he said. That meant everything. Sarah stopped walking, turned back toward him, and smiled the brightest smile of her life. She had accomplished exactly what she had hoped. She had reminded someone that they were valued and appreciated. But she had no idea that her small act of kindness had done something much bigger. The crowd of witnesses began to stir, but not with the usual tourist excitement. Instead, there was a different energy, something warmer and more thoughtful. People looked at Guardsman Thompson differently now. They weren't seeing a statue or an attraction anymore. They were seeing a young man who had been moved to tears by a stranger's kindness. A middle-aged man from Germany approached the barrier and nodded, respectfully to James, offering a sincere thank you in accented English. A woman from Japan bowed slightly in his direction. A teenager from Canada looked embarrassed as she remembered the silly faces she had been making earlier, trying to get the guard to laugh. Sarah had started something beautiful and unexpected. Her single moment of compassion was creating ripples that spread through the crowd like warm water, changing how dozens of people saw not just this guard, but perhaps how they would treat all service people in the future. But the story was far from over. Within minutes, someone would capture video of what happened next, and Sarah's simple hug would travel around the world faster than she could ever have imagined. The consequences, both wonderful and challenging, were just beginning. What happened next surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. As she began walking away from Guardsman Thompson, she noticed that the entire atmosphere around the palace gates had changed. The remaining tourists weren't laughing or making jokes anymore. Instead, they were looking at the guards with new eyes, eyes that saw fellow human beings rather than living statues. A woman from France approached Sarah as she moved through the crowd. "Excusez-moi," she said in broken English. "That was very beautiful, very kind." She gestured toward where James still stood at his post, though now his posture seemed somehow different, still professional, but with a subtle warmth that hadn't been there before. Sarah found herself surrounded by small groups of people who wanted to talk about what they had just witnessed. An elderly gentleman from Wales shook his head in wonder. "In all my years visiting here, I've never seen anything like that," he said. "Made me think about how we treat these young lads, it did." Meanwhile, James was experiencing his own transformation. The warmth of Sarah's gesture was still flowing through him, making his cold, wet uniform feel somehow more bearable. For the first time in months, he didn't feel invisible. One person had seen him, really seen him, and that changed everything. But James also knew he was in uncharted territory. Royal guards weren't supposed to show emotion or break protocol, even in small ways. He had whispered thank you to a tourist and shed a tear while on duty, actions that could potentially result in discipline or even dismissal from his position. The thought worried him, but he couldn't bring himself to regret what had happened. About 20 minutes after Sarah's encounter, a young man with his phone started recording video near the guard's position. He had missed the original moment with Sarah, but he was documenting the unusual scene that was unfolding. Tourists were now treating the guards with obvious respect and kindness. People were saying, "Thank you," as they walked past. Some left small gifts, flowers, candies, even umbrellas to help shield the guards from rain. The video captured something remarkable. Instead of the usual circus atmosphere, there was a sense of reverence and appreciation. The young man filming didn't know exactly what had triggered this change, but he could sense it was something special. An older tourist from Australia who had witnessed Sarah's hug approached the person filming. "You should have seen what happened earlier," she said excitedly. "This young American woman came up and hugged that guard right there. Not in a disrespectful way. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. She treated him like a real person, and he actually cried. Changed the whole mood here, it did." The person with the phone immediately became more interested. "Really? Do you know who she was?" "No idea," the Australian woman replied, but she had the kindest face, said she could see he was cold and tired. It was like she reminded all of us that these guards are someone's sons and daughters, you know. As word spread through the crowd about what had happened, more people began sharing their own observations. They talked about how they had never really thought about the guards as individual people before, how they had focused only on the spectacle and tradition without considering the human cost. Sarah, meanwhile, had found a nearby cafe where she sat with a cup of tea, processing what had just occurred. She kept thinking about the tear that had rolled down James's cheek and the gratitude in his whispered, "Thank you." She wondered if she had done the right thing or if she had somehow made his job more difficult. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister back in Phoenix. "How's London? Send pics." Sarah looked through the photos she had taken over the past 2 days, but none of them seemed to capture the most important moment of her trip. How could she explain to her family that the best part of her vacation hadn't been seeing Big Ben or the Tower of London, but simply showing kindness to a stranger? Back at the palace, the ripple effects of Sarah's gesture continued to grow. Guards at other posts began noticing the changed behavior of tourists. Instead of trying to make them laugh or break character, people were offering respectful nods and genuine thanks. Some guards later said it was the most pleasant day they had experienced in months. James's commanding officer, Sergeant Major Williams, happened to walk by during his afternoon rounds and immediately noticed the different atmosphere. He had been doing this job for 15 years and could read crowd dynamics instinctively. Something had shifted, and it was affecting not just the tourists but his guards as well. "Thompson," he said quietly as he paused near James's position, "Everything all right here?" Noticed the crowd seemed different today. James maintained his forward gaze but responded in the barely audible voice guards used to communicate with superiors during duty. "Yes, sir. Had an unusual interaction earlier. Tourist showed some kindness, seemed to change the mood, sir." Sergeant Major Williams raised an eyebrow. "Unusual how?" "She treated me like a person, sir. Said thank you for my service. Crowd's been more respectful ever since." The sergeant major nodded slowly. In his years of service, he had seen guards struggle with the dehumanizing aspects of their duty. If one tourist's kindness had improved morale and crowd behavior, he saw that as nothing but positive. What none of them knew was that someone in the crowd had managed to capture a few seconds of video showing the aftermath of Sarah's gesture. James with obvious tears on his cheeks and tourists treating him with newfound respect. That video would be uploaded to social media within the hour, beginning a chain reaction that would reach millions of people around the world. The story was about to become much bigger than one American tourist's simple act of kindness to one British guard. It was about to become a phenomenon that would make people everywhere reconsider how they treat those who serve them in ways both big and small. By evening, Sarah was back in her small hotel room, completely unaware that her simple act of kindness was about to change her life forever. She had spent the afternoon exploring London's museums, but her mind kept drifting back to the moment. She had hugged Guardsman Thompson and seen that single tear roll down his cheek. Meanwhile, across the city, James had finished his shift and was back in the barracks, still processing what had happened. As he changed out of his wet uniform, he found the tissues and hand warmer that Sarah had left in his pocket. The small gifts felt precious to him, not because of their monetary value, but because they represented something he had almost forgotten existed: genuine human care from a complete stranger. His fellow guards noticed his unusually good mood. "You seem different tonight, Thompson," said his roommate, Guardsman Davis. "Usually you're pretty quiet after palace duty." James smiled as he carefully placed the hand warmer on his bedside table. "Something nice happened today. A tourist, actually, treated me like a human being. First time in months someone looked at me and saw a person instead of just a uniform." "Really? What did they do?" "She hugged me," James said simply. "Told me she could see I was cold and tired. Left me these." He showed Davis the small gifts. "Sounds silly, but it meant everything." Davis shook his head in amazement. "In 3 years of guard duty, I've never had anything like that happen. Most tourists just want to see if they can make us laugh or flinch." What neither of them knew was that at that exact moment, a video titled "Tourist Kindness Makes Royal Guard Cry, Faith in Humanity Restored" was beginning to spread across social media platforms at an incredible pace. The video had been posted by Marcus Chen, a college student from London who had been at the palace that afternoon. He had arrived just after Sarah's encounter with James, but his phone had captured the aftermath: the tear-stained guard, the respectful crowd, and several tourists thanking the guards with obvious sincerity. Marcus had added a caption explaining what witnesses had told him about the American woman who had hugged the guard. Within 2 hours, the video had been shared thousands of times. Within 6 hours, it had reached hundreds of thousands of views across multiple platforms. The comment section became a river of emotions. People from around the world shared their own stories about acts of kindness they had witnessed or experienced. Many expressed shame about their own past behavior towards service workers and guards. Others praised Sarah, calling her a real-life angel and an example of what humanity should be. "This made me cry," wrote someone from Canada. "I never thought about how those guards must feel having people mock them all day." "I was a soldier for 10 years, commented a veteran from Australia. "The loneliness of service is real." This woman understood something most people don't. "Faith in humanity restored," wrote dozens of people, using the phrase that would eventually make it into news headlines. By the next morning, major news outlets were picking up the story. The BBC, CNN, and news organizations across Europe were all running segments about the American tourist who made a royal guard cry with kindness. Sarah woke up to her phone buzzing constantly with notifications. Her sister had seen the video and immediately recognized the description of the kind American woman who had been at Buckingham Palace the day before. "Sarah," her sister had texted in all caps, "is this you? There's a video going viral about an American tourist hugging a royal guard yesterday. The description sounds exactly like what you would do." Confused and still half asleep, Sarah clicked on the link her sister had sent. She watched in amazement as news anchors discussed her actions, calling her gesture a beautiful reminder of our shared humanity and an example of kindness in an often cruel world. The video showed James after their encounter, with clear evidence of tears on his cheeks and tourists treating all the guards with newfound respect. Sarah felt a mix of emotions: joy that her gesture had meant so much to James, surprise that it had been noticed by so many people, and worry about whether all this attention might cause problems for him. Meanwhile, James was experiencing his own shock. His commanding officers had called him in for a meeting, and he was terrified that he was about to be disciplined for showing emotion while on duty. Instead, he found himself facing a room full of senior officers who had been fielding calls from media outlets all morning. "Thompson," said Colonel Richardson, the commanding officer, "it seems you've become quite famous overnight. There's a video circulating that shows you in an emotional state during yesterday's duty. Can you explain what happened?" James straightened his shoulders and told the complete truth. He described Sarah's approach, her kind words, the small gifts she had given him, and how her genuine humanity had moved him to tears despite his training. "And you responded to this tourist?" the colonel asked. I said, "Thank you, sir." It seemed appropriate. To James's surprise, Colonel Richardson smiled. "Son, in my 30 years of service, I've seen a lot of things, but I've never seen a single act of kindness create such positive publicity for the regiment." The phone hasn't stopped ringing, with reporters wanting to talk about the crying guard and the angel tourist. He gestured to a stack of newspapers on his desk. Every major publication is running this story. They're calling it a beautiful moment of human connection. The palace has received hundreds of messages praising both you and this American woman. James felt relief wash over him. "So I'm not in trouble, sir?" "Trouble? Thompson, you've just shown the world that our guards are human beings with hearts and feelings. You've made people see us differently. The Queen herself has been briefed on this incident, and she found it touching." The colonel leaned forward. "However, we do need to discuss how to handle the media attention. This story is bigger than any of us expected, and it's still growing. We need to decide whether you want to participate in interviews or if you'd prefer to let the story speak for itself." As James considered his options, neither he nor Sarah realized that their brief encounter had started something much larger than either of them had imagined. Their story was inspiring copycat acts of kindness around the world, changing how people treated service workers, guards, and others in uniform positions. The ripples from one American tourist's simple hug were about to become waves that would touch millions of lives across the globe. 3 days after the hug that changed everything, Sarah found herself sitting in a London television studio, still hardly believing what was happening. The story had exploded beyond anything she could have imagined. News outlets from dozens of countries wanted to interview the American angel, who had reminded the world about the power of simple kindness. James had also agreed to participate in interviews, with approval from his superiors. The military had decided that the positive attention was beneficial for the regiment and helped humanize their service members in the public eye. During their joint television interview on BBC's Good Morning Britain, Sarah and James met again, for the first time since that rainy day at Buckingham Palace. The moment was emotional for both of them. "When I saw you standing there in the rain," Sarah explained to the host, "I didn't see a royal guard or a tourist attraction. I saw a young man who looked cold and tired and maybe a little lonely. I thought about my own brother, who's about the same age, and I wondered how I would want someone to treat him if he were in a similar situation." James nodded as she spoke. "What Sarah did was give me back my humanity for a moment. After months of being treated like a statue, having someone acknowledge that I'm a real person with feelings, it was overwhelming. Her kindness reminded me why I serve and made me proud of what I do." The host asked Sarah what she hoped people would learn from her experience. "That everyone we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about," Sarah replied. "That security guard, that cashier, that person in uniform, they all have lives, families, dreams, and struggles just like us. A little kindness costs nothing but can mean everything." The interview was watched by millions of people, and the response was immediate and powerful. Social media exploded with stories of people inspired by Sarah's example to show kindness to service workers in their own communities. A hashtag emerged, #CriSiC, the person not the uniform. People began sharing videos and stories of acts of kindness toward guards, police officers, military personnel, retail workers, and others in service positions. Restaurant workers received unexpected tips and thank you notes. Security guards found hot coffee waiting for them on cold nights. Postal workers discovered small gifts left in mailboxes with notes of appreciation. But the impact went deeper than social media trends. Organizations around the world began implementing programs to recognize and appreciate their frontline workers. Tourism boards started campaigns educating visitors about treating local workers with respect and dignity. The British Army reported a significant increase in recruitment inquiries, with many applicants citing the viral story as inspiration to serve their country. Several guards at Buckingham Palace mentioned that tourists now regularly approach them with kind words and small gifts, transforming their daily experience from one of endurance to one of positive human interaction. Sarah's planned 2-week vacation in London extended to a month as she found herself invited to speak at conferences schools, and community events. She was amazed by how hungry people seemed to be for reminders about kindness and human connection. "I keep thinking about how small my gesture really was," she told audiences. "A hug that lasted 3 seconds, a few kind words, some tissues, and a hand warmer that cost less than $5. But sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest changes." James, meanwhile, found that his perspective on his job had completely transformed. Instead of dreading his shifts at the palace, he now looked forward to them. The job hadn't changed, but the way people treated him had changed dramatically. More importantly, the way he saw his role had evolved. "I used to focus on the difficulty of standing still while people ignored my humanity," he explained in interviews. "Now I see my position as an opportunity to represent something bigger than myself. When children wave at me and I can't wave back, I try to let kindness show in my eyes. When tourists are respectful, I try to radiate appreciation even though I can't speak." 6 months after their encounter, Sarah and James had both become advocates for kindness and human dignity. Sarah started a nonprofit organization called See the Person that promoted awareness about treating service workers with respect. James became a spokesperson for military mental health initiatives and regularly spoke about the importance of recognizing the humanity in those who serve. The ripple effects continued to spread. Teachers began using their story in classrooms to discuss empathy and kindness. Therapists referenced it in sessions about the power of human connection. Corporate trainers used it as an example of how small actions can create positive change in workplace culture. Perhaps most remarkably, Buckingham Palace itself instituted changes. They created information signs explaining the role and sacrifice of royal guards, helping tourists understand that these were active military personnel deserving of respect. They also established a program allowing guards to take brief breaks for water and rest during extreme weather conditions. A year later, Sarah and James reunited at Buckingham Palace for a special ceremony. The Queen had decided to recognize both of them for their role in promoting kindness and positive relations between the military and the public. Sarah received an honorary award for her contribution to British-American friendship, while James was commended for his service and his role as an ambassador for the armed forces. Standing in the same spot where they had first met, both reflected on how much their lives had changed. Sarah had left her job at the diner and now traveled the world speaking about kindness and human dignity. She had written a book about her experience called The Hug That Changed Everything, with all proceeds going to charities supporting military families and mental health initiatives. James had been promoted and now served as a liaison between the Palace Guard and tourism organizations, helping to educate visitors about military service and tradition. He had also become engaged to Emma, his girlfriend who had been so impressed by how he handled the media attention and used his newfound platform to help others. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if it had been raining a little harder that day?" Sarah asked James as they stood together, watching tourists respectfully observing the current guards on duty. James smiled. "I think about that sometimes, but then I remember that kindness finds a way. If it hadn't been you that day, maybe it would have been someone else. Or maybe I would have found the courage to show my humanity in a different way." They watched as a young girl approached one of the guards with her mother. Instead of trying to make funny faces or get a reaction, the child simply said, "Thank you for keeping everyone safe," before walking away with her family. The guard's eyes followed them with obvious appreciation. "Look at that," Sarah whispered. "That little girl will probably never know that her words just made that guard's entire day better. She's learned to see the person behind the uniform." As they prepared to leave the palace grounds, Sarah and James were approached by Marcus Chen, the college student whose video had started the viral phenomenon. He was now working as a journalist and had covered their story from the beginning. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked them. "Your lives completely changed because of one moment. Do you ever wish it had stayed private?" Sarah and James looked at each other and smiled. They had discussed this question many times over the past year. "Never," Sarah said firmly. "If our story helped even one person treat someone with more kindness, then all the attention was worth it. Besides, the world needs more reminders that we're all human beings deserving of dignity and respect." James nodded in agreement. The day Sarah hugged me, I felt invisible and forgotten. Now I wake up every day knowing that my service matters, and that people see me as more than just a uniform. That's a gift I never expected. As they walked away from Buckingham Palace together, Sarah and James had no idea that their story would continue inspiring acts of kindness for years to come. Teachers would tell their students about the tourist and the guard. Parents would use their example to teach children about empathy. Travelers around the world would remember their story and treat local service workers with greater respect and appreciation. The moment that started with a simple hug on a rainy day in London had become a lasting reminder that in a world that often feels divided and harsh, the smallest acts of kindness can create the most profound changes. It proved that when we choose to see the person behind the uniform, the job title, or the role, we open the door to connections that can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Years later, visitors to Buckingham Palace would still sometimes ask guards about the crying guard and the American tourist. New guards would learn the story as part of their orientation, not as a cautionary tale about breaking protocol, but as an example of how their service connects them to people around the world who appreciate their sacrifice and dedication. Sarah Martinez from Phoenix had saved for 3 years to see London, hoping to expand her world beyond her small hometown. She succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, not by seeing famous landmarks, but by recognizing the humanity in a stranger and choosing to act on that recognition with simple, genuine kindness. The hug lasted only seconds, but its impact would last forever.